Hi again, welcome to video 10. So today, our essential question is, what were the consequences of the Canadian expansion westward? So if you take a look at this poster behind me, this is one of the prototypical posters you would have seen plastered throughout Europe to try and recruit people to move across the ocean and settle in what they called the last best west. And so we're going to look at some success criteria in a moment. So first, we're going to look at, we're going to be able to indicate the goal of the federal government with expansion going west. We'll be able to indicate the purpose of the Indian Act in 1876. You're going to be able to explain the reaction from the Métis and Aboriginal people. And finally, you'll be able to explain nationalism and how it grew among French Canadians as a result of Louis Riel being hanged. I hope you enjoyed today's video. Got a lot to cover, so let's get started. Okay, so we're going to look at the development of the Canadian Federation. So before we answer the essential question, let's just first take a look at the reasons for expansion, which is success criteria number 1, which is the goal of the federal government. So basically, Sir John A. Macdonald, the Prime Minister of Canada, he has the task of expanding the Canadian territory. And so here is the map. And basically, the Dominion of Canada consists of Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. And the important thing is that in 1868, people are sent to London to start negotiating the purchase of all of this territory right here. In 1869, the transaction is completed, and for $1.5 million, the Canadian Federation purchases almost 7 million square kilometers of land. And so Manitoba is the first province to join the Federation in 1870, followed by British Columbia in 1871, followed by Prince Edward Island in 1873. It wasn't until 1905 that Alberta and Saskatchewan become provinces. Mind you, they were owned by Canada when they purchased all that territory, but they didn't actually become their own provinces till 1905. Okay, so Alberta and Saskatchewan. The last province to join the Canadian Federation was actually Newfoundland, and it wasn't until 1949. Another thing to keep in mind, all this territory up here, what are called the Arctic Islands, which were owned by Britain at that time, they are basically given to Canada in 1880, and then eventually they would become the territories, right? Yukon, Newfoundland, or sorry, Yukon, Northwest Territory, and Nunavut. Okay, but now to our first success criteria. So what were the reasons for this expansion? Well, the very first goal is quite simple. It was to acquire the immense territory west of the borders. So once again, if you look, the borders at that time had ended right here. They knew it was important to keep all of this. Why did they know that that was important? Well, there were 3 main reasons why they felt it necessary to do that. So the 3 reasons are, 1, it was a place for Canadians to settle, so it was new land. 2, it was an economic base to further develop the economy. And 3, it was to, I should put a little bracket there. 3, it was to protect against American occupation and annexation. So all 3 of these things we'll talk about further in class. But those are the 3 goals, or the 3 reasons for it. Okay, so now we're going to shift our focus to our essential question, which is, what were the consequences of westward expansion? So before the federal government could actually colonize the land to the west of the Dominion, the federal government decided to negotiate with the Aboriginal peoples who lived in the territory. So in the years following Confederation, the government signed a number of treaties with Aboriginal peoples in order to acquire the land legally. So in exchange for the land, the government promised to create reserves for the Aboriginals that would provide them with medical service, food aid, clothing, among other things. So one of the consequences was the creation of reserves. And a reserve is a territory reserved for Aboriginal peoples and administered or run by, right? Who runs it? That was run by or administered by the federal government. Okay, so that's what a reserve is. So in 1876, the federal government passes what is now called, it's an important concept, the Indian Act is what it's called, and that is signed in 1876. So this act provides that Aboriginal peoples would, from then on, be considered as minors under the law and would have no political rights. Okay, so with the signing of the Indian Act, that's what happens to Aboriginals. They were confined to their reserves, so that piece of land that's reserved for them, and the government took over the administration of their lands. So that was a consequence. So you might be asking yourself, well, why did the Aboriginals agree to that? Well, if you take a look at this image right here, it's pretty powerful. This picture right here, if you look into the background, all of this stuff right here, those are bison bones. The bison was an animal that was almost hunted to extinction in the 70s and 80s. And so the Aboriginal peoples of the West were deprived of their main source of food. So threatened with starvation, they agreed to move on to the reserves where the government had promised to provide them with food. Take a look here. Here's a picture of the Canadian Pacific Railroad, and you can see like the head of a bison. These are all bison bones. So basically it was out of due to starvation that they're like, okay, well, you know, we don't really have much of a choice, so we'll go on these reserves. Here's a really famous picture of a young boy named Thomas More, and this was the assimilation of Aboriginal peoples. So once the government set up reserves, they also set up what were called residential schools, or the residential school system, and these were designed to sort of quicken the assimilation of Aboriginal peoples into Western culture. So these two photos show Thomas More right here. This is him as an Aboriginal boy before residential schools, and then this is him enrolled in a school in Regina. It's the same boy. So you could kind of see another consequence was the assimilation of Aboriginal peoples through residential schools. Okay. Okay, so continuing with the consequences. So the Canadian government's first step in colonizing the West was to send people to what was called the Red River area in Manitoba. They were sent, specifically it's kind of like what would be modern day Winnipeg. So that region had been home for many, many years to a group called the Métis, okay? And the Métis were a group of North American, Aboriginal, and European ancestry people that spoke French, okay? And so the people that were living there were basically ignored, like their presence was ignored by people who began to give out concessions, or they started dividing the land up amongst the people who was going to use it. And so worried about losing their land, the Métis contested Canada's rights to govern them. So in December of 1869, the Métis set up their own government under the leadership of this man right here. And this was Louis Riel, okay? And Louis Riel, who was a Francophone Métis, was the leader. So English Canadians who were living in that area refused to accept the Métis government. And so Thomas Scott, who was one of the English Canadians, was actually captured, jailed, and he was actually executed in 1870. And this really upset the federal government. So Canadian troops were sent into that area to deal with the Métis. So to settle the crisis, the government created the province of Manitoba, and they promised Francophone and Anglophone Métis titles to their lands. So everybody would have land, as well as they would respect their language and religion, particularly in schools. Now, that being said, the Métis decided to move even further westward, and they formed a new community all the way out at Batoche, Saskatchewan, which can be seen right here. So in 1885, the Métis once again faced new land ownership difficulties. Fearing the worst from a massive, massive influx of immigrants and the construction of railroad lines, led by Louis Riel, they actually led a rebellion against the Canadian government. Riel was once again the leader, and this rebellion actually failed, and Riel was thrown into jail. So this image right here is actually the capture of Batoche. So Louis Riel and his men made a few attacks on the government, but they were outnumbered by the well-armed troops that Ottawa, the capital, had rushed to Saskatchewan. And so on May 15th, 1885, Riel was forced to surrender. So this man right here was actually captured and was guilty of high treason. And so he was actually sentenced to be to death by hanging. Okay, so Louis Riel was hung. Okay, so in the late 19th century, so the late 1800s, a growing feeling began to come over Quebec. Many French Canadians were absolutely shocked and appalled by the hanging of Louis Riel, and they felt that the federal government failed to respect minority rights. So the Conservative Party, which had been in power in Quebec since 1879, soon came to be associated with the policies of Macdonald's federal Conservative government and increasingly lost support in the province. So a new man emerges. This man right here, this is Honoré Mercier. Mercier, that's an E. That's an E accent aigu. That's an O. It's hard to read. Honoré Mercier, we'll talk about him. He was a French Canadian, and he rallied the dissatisfied people who were upset with the whole Riel affair. And in 1886, he got enough support in provincial elections to win. So he was the defender of French Canadian nationalism. So nationalism, which was a concept whereby it's like a political doctrine that promotes the existence and development of a nation. So it's basically supporting and belonging to a specific nation. Okay, so that came out of this. In particular, he was leading the French-Canadian nationalism. French-Canadian nationalism. And the thing to take away from that is that a new party began to be formed, one that was called the Parti National. And we will be discussing that further in class. And this was basically he proposed a union of all French Canadians, and basically he strove to protect Francophone minorities in every part of the country. Thanks for watching video 10. Before you go, let's be reminded of our essential question and success criteria. Our essential question was, what were the consequences of the Canadian Federation expanding westward? In order to show me that you can successfully answer that, you must be able to indicate the goal of the federal government, indicate the purpose of the Indian Act in 1876, explain the reaction of the Métis and the Aboriginal people, and explain nationalism and how it grew after Louis Riel's death. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.